Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the seminar, How Traditional Owners are Powering the Clean Energy Transition, which is hosted by Melbourne Climate Futures. My name's Lockie McLeod, and I'm a PhD candidate based at the university with Melbourne Climate Futures in the Faculty of Arts. I'll be moderating today's seminar that's presented by Dr. Lily O'Neill, who also happens to be my supervisor. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this seminar is taking place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank and extend this acknowledgement to any First Nations people with us today and any of you joining us online from any other traditional lands across the country. Today's seminar is hosted by Melbourne Climate Futures here at the University of Melbourne. MCF brings together research and expertise from across the university to learn, educate and guide discussions on climate change and climate research. Just to note that this seminar has been recorded and the recording will be made available on the university's YouTube channel. We'll be running a Q&A after the presentation, where we'll take some questions from both our online and in-person audiences. For any of us online, feel free to use Zoom's Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of the screen, to leave any questions you have for Lily throughout the seminar. Please also upvote any questions you'd particularly like to see answered. We're absolutely delighted today to welcome Lily from here at the Uni of Melbourne. Lily's a Senior Research Fellow for Melbourne Climate Futures. She's a lawyer and legal researcher with a particular focus on how the legal frameworks for renewable energy, nature restoration and climate adaptation can benefit communities. A particular focus is undertaking research that is traditional owner-led. Lily's also a writer and presenter on Climate Kids, a show that answers kids' questions about climate change, and on the board to Protect Our Winters Australia. And I'd love to hand over to Lily to kick off today's seminar.
Look, there's only a few of us here. There might be a few more online. So please, anyone, I know there's quite a few people here too who work in this area professionally. So please do feel free to interrupt me at any stage, because it would be great if we just had a big discussion about these issues. Okay. I'd like to echo Lockie's acknowledgement of country. I live on the unceded lands of the Taungurung people in northeastern Victoria, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and just really say that for those of us who are really concerned, as I'm sure we all are, in this fight against climate change, what Western science is increasingly catching up on is that First Nations methods of managing country are so much better than many other methods. And if we were to just hand the job to First Nations people, we'd all be in a better place. So, first of all, who owns Australia? So this is a map on First Nations rights and interests in land across Australia. You'll see that a lot of the Northern Territory is held under land rights legislation, and then there's a fair bit of native title tenure as well. Many of you I know are lawyers, but for the non-lawyers in the room, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have been claiming their traditional country under Australian settler law since about the mid-1970s. And then the seminal Mabo case of 1992 came along, and the Native Title Act was enacted soon afterwards, Native Title Act 1993. And so since the mid-70s and then the early 90s for native title, progressively parts of Australia have been claimed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Rights and interests in sea country are not displayed on this map. Now, for traditional owners to be able to claim their country under Australian law, it's quite a complicated test. They've got to show that they have a continuing connection to country. They've got to show that that land was not granted as a legal estate to anybody else. And they've got to be able to show that they still hold that land according to traditional law and custom. It's a hard test. If you have a look at the map of Australia, you'll see that where rights are strongest, exclusive possession native title in the red there, is also the areas in Australia that were least attractive to the colonial project. Okay, so it's no accident that areas where traditional rights and interests are strongest are also those areas that were deemed less attractive in the colonial project. However, as we enter the clean energy transition, look at this. Woo! Those areas are also where we have some of the best photovoltaic power potential. And we're seeing this all around the world. It's accidental, okay? The colonial authorities did not intend to leave some of the best PV land available for traditional owners, but it is the case throughout a whole lot of areas. And I don't have a map up there for wind potential, but it often follows similar patterns. And we see this pattern also in the United States and Canada. Now, this clean energy transition is going to be one of the major industries that hits the Indigenous estates since the mining boom. During the mining boom, the Minerals Council estimated that about 60% of the minerals that were dug up all throughout the early 2000s were dug up from or next to land owned by First Nations people, 60%. Likewise, Net Zero Australia estimates that about 43% of new energy systems will be on land subject to some sort of level of Indigenous rights and interests in land. Since the advent of the Native Title Act, and from the late 90s onwards, the Native Title Act really facilitated a process that Marcia Langton has called agreement making, which is essentially traditional owners coming to an agreement with those people who want to access their land and do something on their land. Since that time, there's been about 1,500 agreements struck, about 500 of which were for mining oil and gas. Now, one of the major features of these agreements, does anyone want to hazard a guess?
Do they expire?
That's a very good question. I don't know, potentially. Anyone else? Nick?
Like conquer people and then they can screw them because they fight amongst themselves. That's
Might be. The biggest commonality about all these agreements are they're confidential. And we don't know what's in them. We do not know what's in them. So they're a major part of the development that's occurring on First Nations people's traditionally owned country. There's often, when a deal is done, there'll be a splash of a media article about it. There'll be a company who says, we've done all these amazing deals, free, prior and informed consent has been these have been according to free, prior and informed consent. But in actual fact, we don't actually know what's on in the agreement. And often the traditional owners themselves don't know what's on in the agreement for their own country. There'll be named applicants who've negotiated the deal, but often a specification is that the terms of the deal will remain confidential even to those people who themselves are traditional owners for that country. They're confidential. So, people like me, researchers, lawyers who want to, when someone says it's a great deal and you say, well, show me the terms, show me the fine print. We've done some digging, particularly a Queenslander called Kieran O'Farkley who's done a lot of digging. And there's maybe 10 or 15 agreements that aren't confidential, 10 or 15, something like that. I'm looking at Nick, something like that. But also, there's been quite a few of these agreements for mining oil and gas that have been given to researchers like me to assess the terms of them, but keep other details confidential. So, from those 1,500 agreements in Australia and from agreements in other similar countries, Canada, New Zealand, United States, what we know is that there are 4 factors as to whether or not that agreement will be strong for the traditional owners. And when I say strong for the traditional owners, that's across a wide variety of categories. So financial benefit, protection of cultural heritage, employment and training, etc. Environmental protection. And those 4 factors, this is for mining oil and gas, those 4 factors are firstly, the political power of the First Nations organisation. That is the single most important factor as to whether or not they will negotiate a strong agreement. Second is the ethos of the developer. Third are the legal rights in which the development occurs. And fourth is the economics of the proposed project. And now you might think that if a traditional owner group is negotiating an agreement, they might say, okay, well, we'd really like strong cultural heritage protection and environmental protection, and we're happy to trade away financial benefit. You might think that there might be that trade-off. No. What the research has found is if an agreement is strong in one area, it's likely strong in all the areas. And if it's weak in one area, it's likely weak in all the areas. And so the sorts of groups who are negotiating really strong agreements are usually those who are represented by a very strong organisation, the Kimberley Land Councils of this world, of Australia. So going to this third factor, the legal rights in which the development occurs. So under the Native Title Act, anytime there's some sort of dealing on native title land, it's called a future act in the legalese of the Native Title Act. And essentially what the legislation sets out is that traditional owners cannot say no to mining oil and gas on their land. It's like you, madam, selling your house, someone makes you an offer, but you know you can't say no to them. Right? Yeah, okay? They've come to you, they've made you an offer, you've got 6 months to sit at the table with them and thrash out an offer, but at the end of the day, you know you can't say no to them. How strong is your leverage?
I'll be pretty annoyed.
Yeah, right? You're pretty annoyed. Okay. So since the advent of the Native Title Act, traditional owners have probably wanted to say no, like you, madam, to selling your house, many, many, many times. Sorry, what's your name?
Liz.
Liz. Liz, you've wanted to say no many, many times, but you know that the law's stacked against you, okay? So, but since the advent of the Act, traditional owners have said no in a very official capacity, and it's gone to the arbitral body, the National Native Title Tribunal, as opposed to council, on 153 occasions. I think it might be 155 now. How many times has this arbitral body, the tribunal, sided with traditional owners? Good guess. So it's 153 to 155 times. Liz?
5.
In between you two. Well done. If I had a Freddo frog for you both, 3. There's a 4th possibility on Monday. Okay, so what are your odds? How confident are you if you're going to the tribunal? Not very confident. Okay. So this is for mining. I've got some good news for everybody. You're all feeling a little depressed, Liz? You're like, this is really unfair. Okay. Now we come to renewable energy projects on First Nations land. And this is a really good resource on the First Nations Clean Energy Network website. The network are a terrific advocacy organisation who've made fantastic inroads in this space since they were formed in 2021. And they have this tracker of all the large-scale renewable energy projects that have been proposed for the Indigenous estate. 21 at the moment, 2 currently in construction, I believe. A lot of these are at a very early stage or a planning stage. Now, what's the good news about renewable energy projects on First Nations land, legally wise? They weren't thought of when the Native Title Act was written. They weren't thought of. No one had thought of them. And so there was no pathway through the Act that envisaged renewable energy projects. What does that mean? It means that native mining and oil companies, including mining companies, there's a lot of mining companies in the renewable energy space now, can't rely on an arbitral body like the National Native Title Tribunal to force projects through. The only avenue through the Act is a voluntary one through an Indigenous land use agreement. What does that mean? Power shift. Total power shift. Traditional owners can say no. As a lawyer, this makes me very proud, the law being useful, right? Okay, there we go. Renewable energy projects. So this is just a little diagram that shows you a few of the differences between these projects. National Native Title Tribunal can say no for mining oil and gas. Clean energy, they can't. And then a few other differences there that I'll go into a little bit later. So, knowing now that all these agreements are confidential, knowing that renewable energy companies, like mining companies, and a lot of them are the same. There's a lot of mining companies who are trying to decarb their operations by building large, particularly solar arrays next to their mines, are saying many of the same things that the mining companies said about their agreements. They're saying things like, these are wonderful agreements, they're going to really benefit traditional owners, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. This area is not as well developed yet as for mining, but a couple of years ago I set out to find out, well, is this true? What is actually going into these agreements? Again, they're all confidential. I have yet to read one myself. What did I do to try and find out information about what's going on? Talk to people. Lawyers are wonderful gossips. Okay, lawyers, we were bound by legal professional privilege, but we can talk about broad trends of what's going on in the agreement. So what I'm about to tell you is based on what 15 people said about what are the broad scale trends going into these agreements. Those people were traditional owners and non-traditional owners. They were lawyers, they were accountants, they represented community, and there was a mixture of representing companies and communities. Other than that, I can't tell you anything more. I guaranteed them all anonymity. Okay, so what are the findings? What did these 15 people tell me about what's going on in these agreements? First of all, for someone who'd spent a long time researching mining, oil and gas agreements, I was really, really surprised and gratified that the story is a lot better than it was for mining. And principally, this is because of this issue of consent. And a number of lawyers described this lack of pathway through the Native Title Act as an effective veto right. Now, it hasn't been tested by any court. Maybe some court would come up with some clever argument about how it's not a veto right, but at the moment, as it stands, most people seem to think it's a veto right. Also, there's a number of states throughout Australia who explicitly require a voluntary agreement to be done with traditional owners, an Indigenous land use agreement. So, the power balance has shifted for these agreements. The First Nations Clean Energy Network, as I said, have been very active in this space, and that has made a real difference too to elevating the conversation about what should occur. These people also told me that cultural heritage has become a lot easier to protect for renewable energy, for renewable projects than it was for mining, oil and gas. Now, I'm sure most of us here know about the awful destruction of Juukan Gorge in Western Australia by Rio Tinto in 2020, blowing up priceless cultural heritage. Because one of the major differences with renewable energy is that, unlike mining, you've got your, deposit of iron ore, that's where it is, you've got a mine there. For renewable energy, the solar and wind resource is probably fairly similar, spread over a greater area. So if you've got a cultural heritage site where you can't put a wind tower or solar panel, you can just shift it slightly. So in theory, cultural heritage is easier to protect for these sorts of projects than it is for mining, which is great news. Another thing I was told is that the payments are quite significant, although as for mining, it's still a negotiation. You still get, Liz, for your house in Moonee Ponds, you're still getting lowball offers at the start, and, you say, are you dreaming? And then the price comes up. So I was told by one lawyer that the price is coming up 10 times from the initial lowball offer. So we're still seeing really lowball offers. As we saw in mining, it's still a negotiation, but that payments can be quite significant. In terms of, again, one of the issues that came up in the Juukan Gorge inquiry into why traditional owner requests not to blow up Juukan Gorge were ignored, this issue of dispute resolution clauses in agreements also came up, and that there are actually much more dispute resolution clauses in agreements being included, which means that if the parties have a disagreement about how the agreement's being implemented, there's actually procedures in the agreement for what should happen. You know, the parties should go to mediation, there should be an independent arbiter, something like that, to determine what will occur. This is really good. This builds flexibility and more power into the agreement going forward for traditional owners. Power purchase agreements are being used also as a creative way of giving more control to both traditional owners, and I'll talk a bit about that in a little bit, and also potentially to people who want to ensure that that they are not signing up to an agreement where they, you know, people are going to be screwed over. So I'll skip forward a couple of slides. No one's interrupted me yet for any questions? Please do. Yes, sir.
When you talked about those base level and it's gone up by a factor of 10, there's a role of regulation, the government potentially, that's just like to say, you know, what we know what the electricity price will be, they get a certain percentage and whatever, like, or is it, there's just no opportunity for regulation there?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I'm going to make a point about regulatory complexity in a little bit, and I think that in Australia, we do have far too much regulatory complexity and it stands in the way a lot of times. I think you can have broad principles. The short answer is I don't know the answer to that. What I do think is an answer is ensuring, if we go back to the 4 factors that ensure success, number 1 is still number 1, which is that groups have a strong political organisation and they're resourced to negotiate properly. And so rather than it being potentially governments who regulate, I'd query whether ensuring that groups are properly resourced to obtain their own independent advisors is potentially the better option.
That's funded publicly.
Look, at the moment, it's usually funded by companies. The companies will fund, so if you're negotiating with a renewable energy company, the protocol is that they will pay for your lawyer. That's the accepted protocol.
Is that the accepted, just that's the standard or precedent at the moment, and there isn't a choice of like?
I'd say it's the good manners approach. I'm sure there are companies who don't think they have to do that, and again, you find that that if you're, say, a really big land council, again like the Kimberley Land Council, you would just say you have to pay for our lawyers. If you're a really small organisation who's never had any development on your country at all, it might be a very different story. And you potentially have never had any development on your country and you literally don't know that you can ask them to pay for their lawyers. So that information disparity is really huge still. I didn't really answer your question. But I'm wary of too much regulation, and I think that empowering groups is my gut feeling about where that would be better, but, you know, it's a good point.
Sorry, I have one follow-up.
Yeah. No. It's a great question, no. And a lot of these projects are called PowerPoint projects, like they only exist in a PowerPoint. And so what a lot of companies will do, it's a bit like prospecting for oil and gas. They will prospect for solar and wind. And this could, a major difference too, I will say, for renewable energy as opposed to mining oil and gas is that the groups are doing the prospecting themselves. It's a relatively simple process, and they're going out with met masts, they're testing the winds, you know, the wind power, the photovoltaic resource. They're doing the mapping themselves. And then what can happen is all approvals are put through so that they have regulatory approval, and then a lot of these companies then on-sell it to whoever's going to build it. So it's solar and wind prospecting. It's like, you know, a sort of a Wild West movie where there's people going out and getting the approvals done.
Yeah, the farm people can make $50 to $80 million every year. But what are the profits that go through the energy company?
Don't know. Great question. Don't know.
The question is it a tiny percentage, large percentage? So information not accessible to you?
No, it's not. It's a great question. But again, so groups, when they are organised and well-resourced and savvy, and there's a huge amount of land councils out across Australia who are all those things. And what they will do will be to ask the company to open their books so that they can see, because companies, you know, Liz, whoever's trying to buy your house says, I don't have that much money. I really can't afford it, you know? And there's a lot of land councils around the country who will say, show me the money, show me your books, and I want to actually see your workings out. And depending on, you know, the power, you know, in the negotiation, the company will or won't open their books to show exactly that. But I have no idea.
So why does the government not mandate that the companies open their books?
I mean, I think the government finds it very hard to stand up to big companies of any sort. So,
Yeah. Well, that testify to my assertion that the multinational corporations make and break governments and politicians.
sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't think anyone here would disagree. Okay, so Hector.
When it comes to the veto power that traditional owners have, when it comes to offshore wind farms, given that they're going to be based on the so-called will the same legal leverage apply?
Oh, Hector, right to the heart of the issue. Look, I'm not expert. I'm really no expert in native title rights as they apply offshore. Some groups have native title rights in sea countries, some don't. So the legal situation, I think, is quite complicated. Did you want to know?
Basically, no rights.
There you go.
So it's really the culture, the ethos of the corporation.
Yep.
As to whether the traditional owner group will be able to get an agreement. I think, you know, needs to saying they're currently negotiating quite a good deal.
Yep.
What I've heard with whichever offshore company it is down there. But yeah, no, there are very few rights in the offshore.
This is Santos TV or testing.
No, that's about consultation rights in offshore. Yeah.
Was it, anyway,
Not seen as. No, it wasn't native title. No, it was consultation rights. Yeah, in the offshore legislation. Yeah. Yes.
Right, so that because Victoria expects.
No, it's literally because that's the approach that company wants to take.
Okay, yeah, so it's not one of the states that expects agreements.
Yeah. 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 But Rebecca, on your point, again, if we come back to the 4 reasons that, you know, really dominate whether you negotiate a strong agreement. Number 1 is political power and leverage of the group. Gunai Kurnai have done an amazing job for, you know, creating an environment where companies are expected to do a good deal with them. I'll also say that they've been resourced a lot by the state to bring a negotiation team together.
I think also, sorry, I know. Look, one of the other things states are starting to do, and Victoria obviously has the traditional and Selma now, but they're starting to include where there's licenses, offshore licenses, as an example, are up for tender. They'll put in the process. They'll say, and what are you doing for traditional owners? So it might not necessarily be a regulatory or legislative mandate, but it's a I guess a policy position that someone's pushing that as well. So I think it's a bunch of different things that help to drive that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I know that Chris Bowen is turning up at a lot of meetings with companies and saying things like, we will definitely favour applications that have a strong agreement with traditional owners. Yeah.
But it's not just companies, right? But you think about Timor-Leste, and I was at the University and Aaron Pickering spoke of the case when Indonesia and Australia colluded to redraw the boundaries to get more of the natural resources in that area. So it's nice to say the big companies, but you know, the big or if you think about the United States, you know, trying to get hold of resources in the Ukraine, etc. So
yeah,
it's the companies.
Yeah, look, and you know, you don't want to be in a situation where you're relying on big companies to do the right thing. That's a losing position. Yeah, having said that, the consensus seems to be that renewable energy companies, particularly European renewable energy companies, are bound by higher sets of standards of behaviour than mining companies are.
So is there still a duty to take care of land, and if that doesn't occur, does the multinational or active Australian company still have a right to sue or bring on action because of
So it's a good question. It goes back to what's been negotiated in the agreements, and the answer is I don't know. Yeah, but potentially I know that there have been some agreements for gas that I know about where there are in effect dispute resolution clauses negotiated into the agreement. So if this happens in the environment, this will occur. We can call a stop to operations if groundwater, for example, is called into question. So I know that that has been done for gas agreements. Whether that's occurring in renewable energy agreements, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing about when you're asking lawyers what's in an agreement, you can't get them to go, you know, clause by clause about what's in there. You get them for an hour, you get their headline points.
sorry, like that really a natural thing that you can control, or would it have been some form of agency be that relationship? It'd be more like a war, like, sorry, I'm just.
Look, and this goes back to the main key difference. It's a great question between mining and renewable energy agreements, which is that under renewable energy agreements, there's the veto. You can say no. So if you're going to do a deal, Liz, if you're going to sell your house, you're doing it voluntarily and you get to negotiate. I think it's hugely important. I'll just take you through a couple of examples of successful groups in this space. And again, I mean, you talked about agency. Because of when this development is occurring, because of the nature of the developments, that it's in many ways cheaper to undertake prospecting for wind and solar yourself than it is for mining oil and gas. The agency question is a wonderful one across the country because groups really are taking charge of it themselves. And these three examples are really good examples of groups who've done the prospecting themselves, the wind and solar. They've worked out where to put the solar panels, where to put wind turbines. Some groups, for example, Bangala, are near a substation. And have been really, really canny about how they engage with renewable energy and own renewable energy. So Bangala are traditional owners of the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. They got a little nuclear energy thing there because who doesn't like to have a nuclear energy side note? They successfully fought off a nuclear dump on their country. And I think again, a really good example of this agency across the country. They said no to nuclear. They fought a key court battle against it. They won. And they've said yes to clean energy. So they've got deals for solar, hydrogen humps, battery projects and power lines on their country that will be worth between 50 and 80 million a year in revenue once they're active. They did some really strategic, really canny footwork in ensuring that there was a piece of land on their traditional country which they could not claim under relevant legislation because it had been, in the words of Australian law, extinguished. Their traditional ownership had been extinguished. There was a little loophole in some legislation. They created a bottleneck. And in effect, the Bangala people forced the state of South Australia to sell them this key piece of land next to a substation for $855,000 in freehold. They owned a key bit of land near a substation in freehold, which unlocked a whole lot of other things. So groups are absolutely taking control of renewable energy on their country and are using a wide variety of tools at their disposal. And Bangala, I think, are a really successful group that it'd be great to keep watching into the future. Nari likewise have land in freehold. They're in southern New South Wales. Again, through some really canny buybacks in partnership with Indigenous Land and Sea Corp and some conservation organisations. They too now own their land in freehold, not native title, and they've managed to negotiate a really good deal with some wind companies. They're also in near a transmission lines. Transmission lines are really important, or substations, or being in a place that's good for renewable hydrogen in these circumstances. 40,000 annually a year per wind turbine, of which there are 74. And then Yinjibundi. Yinjibundi are also, like Bangla, a really, really great example of groups absolutely taking control in this space. The Yinjibundi are famous for having said no to a very large mine on their country. They went to the tribunal. Tribunal said it's going to go ahead anyway. Twiggy Forest has a very large mine on their country, and their compensation fight is still going through courts, but they'll be paid a whole lot of compensation for that mine at some stage, but they said no to it and it went ahead anyway. They have also taken real charge of renewable energy on their land. They again did the wind and solar prospecting themselves, and then went out to find a partner. And they have done a deal with ACEN Energy, a Filipino company that will see Yinjibundi take a minimum of 25% to 50% stake in this very, very large project. These projects in remote Western Australia are close to mines, and so they're being used by the big mining companies to decarbonise their operations. So they'll often just have potentially one customer, and that's the mine.
My question that was running in my mind is, given the remoteness of a lot of its locations and the need for transmission lines, kind of answer that question. Is that what's going on? Like, the government otherwise needs to publicly fund running transmission lines out in the middle of Woodville.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not doing that. It's more about providing electricity to a mine, existing mine. What happens when the mine's done? Like, that's...
You have to come up with something else. To some other customer. So yeah, you're right. So if you're going to do renewable energy, you either need to be close to poles and wires, or you need to be in an area that could potentially produce green hydrogen. And there's a whole lot of the Midwest of Western Australia that has been earmarked for green hydrogen, where you use clean energy to produce green hydrogen and it's then shipped off to Asia. Or in these cases, where you're doing a big solar array to decarbonise a local mine. And it's a good question. What happens when the mine closes? Where does that power then go? I don't know. Don't know.
Well, why is it the traditional owners cannot say no? Oil and natural gas projects. And has that stipulation ever been challenged?
So it's a good question. So the roots of that question date back to Queen Elizabeth I's time. And so Queen Elizabeth I, so it's a very old English common law proposition originally. And Queen Elizabeth I, there was a, Thomas Percy was a lord, found some, you're testing me now, silver, I believe, tin, something. I'm looking to Nick. Dug it up. Queen Elizabeth I said it was hers. There was a court case, and the ruling was no, it belongs to the Crown. So in Australia, when the colonial project started in Australia, we inherited those English common law propositions. Those principles, I believe, are so baked into common law and therefore Australian settler law principles, I don't think they'll ever be overturned, which is to say that the Crown, being the governments of states and territories or the Commonwealth, own the underlying minerals and oil and gas. Yeah. Is there any, move to overturn it? I don't think, I don't think so. Don't think so.
There's the other questions with whether there's been three examples, like good examples that feels like going right. So before the number one factor is the strength of First Nations organisation. I'm keen to know what the specific capabilities, governance structures, conditions, if there are common ones across the three examples that are in place for them to have been successful, or that other conditions that have been captured. I wonder, is it local leadership, open cover, existing royalty agreements that are being able to fund this, presence of archives, the strength of the native title determination of that, like all of this.
Yeah, you've mentioned all the things that are in place in those places, but the common ingredient in almost all strong agreements is that there's a strong First Nations organisation who is negotiating on behalf of traditional owners. That organisational capacity, it really is key, and how different groups have developed that organisational capacity, you know, obviously differs across the country. But I mean, you find people like Wayne Bergman, who's the former CEO of the Kimberley Land Council, talking about his experience from agreement to agreement to agreement and how he just got better and better and better at negotiating them. And also, of course, so these agreements are confidential, but they're not confidential to the people who are negotiating them. And so if you've done the Argyle Diamond Mine agreement, you know what went into it, and you can say to the next company, no, in the Argyle Diamond Mine, we did it this way, and it didn't work for these reasons, and, you know, this is what we should do in this agreement. So it can potentially become a situation of the, you know, monopoly. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. I don't know. I hope not. But there is the potential for that. So I'll go back to, I'll just give you now, I'll go back to the buts, right? So good news, but these are the buts. This is the way this good news story is potentially not so good. So first but, existing agreements for mining may allow for a new clean energy facility without the need for a further agreement. Now that picture there is the signing of the Browse LNG hubs. I have permission to use that photo. That's the only reason I used that photo. Everything else had copyright on it. I did that for my PhD. There's Colin Barnett, there's Wayne Bergman. They're signing an agreement. It certainly wouldn't be this agreement, Browse agreement, but there are plenty of bad agreements out there that are written so widely you could drive a truck through the agreement, and there's a big concern on the part of a lot of people that what this will mean is that your old agreement negotiated in 2005 leaves so much wriggle room that your mine can build a new solar array without the need for further compensation to traditional owners. That's a big but. A slight answer to that is that what I've heard in Western Australia at least is that the relevant regulatory authorities like the EPA wouldn't allow that through. They wouldn't allow that through without further compensation to traditional owners. But that's a big but. Informational disparity, we talked a bit about that between communities and companies. Pastoral leaseholders are also in the mix. So native title rights can coexist with pastoral rights. And certainly a few years ago, the information I was getting is that pastoral leaseholders were being paid more than traditional owners for the same project. Now, that may be improving, and certainly I think in the last few years I've heard from lawyers who are negotiating these agreements that that is improving. Renewable energy is a dispersed resource, which is good for protecting cultural heritage, but it also can mean that companies can, if they're negotiating with one group who they are not coming to a good agreement with, they can shift borders and, you know, go along to the next group. That is happening. It's also happening that some groups, particularly, you know, in the Midwest of Western Australia, are literally, you know, have never had any development on their country, are being sent licenses with a, you know, sign here by companies who just sort of think it's a fait accompli that the traditional owners will agree. So that information disparity is real and is an ongoing concern. But it's something that's been taken up really, really strongly by organisations like the First Nations Clean Energy Network. And I think I have one more, but which is regulatory complexity. Going back to your question, sir. So another reason why a company might choose to use a piece of land without any native title rights or without any other kind of First Nations rights and interests, rather than one with native title rights, is because if they go for this land rather than native title land, it's one less approval to get. It's not necessarily that they're choosing a piece of land, they're deliberately excluding traditional owners, they're just saying there's so much regulation, if we can do away with one bit of it, we will. So that's a real issue. Regulatory complexity is being complained about all the time. So this is one of my interviewees said approvals are such a political battle. And when you think that it's going to take 10 years to get all your approvals, forget about it. The project becomes uncommercial. So renewable energy companies are sometimes trying to buy freehold land where they can do away with native title approvals, just because of this issue of regulatory complexity. It's a pattern that's also been noted in a really extensive study in the United States. And in the United States, kick your ass. In the United States, a widespread study across all land, it found that most likely because of regulatory complexity, that renewable energy projects on reservation land were 46% less likely than neighbouring comparable land and to host wind farms, and 110% less likely to host solar than comparable adjacent lands. So this issue of regulatory complexity is very real. And so when you ask me about should government step in to regulate, that's a tough one. So the United States research said that because of this regulatory complexity, it might mean that tribes have to forego $19 billion in lease and tax earnings because of it. And what they, I'll get to you in a second, what they suggest is potentially vesting regulatory capacity with the tribe themselves. So potentially the tribe are the people who do the environmental and cultural heritage approvals. That real kind of self-government idea. Okay.
Perhaps target the regulatory capacity to perhaps certain asset classes of the renewable energy space. So, for example, in the US, they passed I think earlier in the year, they were trying to shorten the approval times for geothermal energy because it's relatively new. So maybe perhaps in the Australian case, if it was like more of a new type of renewable energy, maybe not classic solar or wind or something like that, then the challenges are probably more than 10 years, perhaps 20 to 30 years. And in order for new innovation to occur, would you perhaps have the regulation hurdle or non-regulation hurdle different for specific types of asset classes or renewable energy classes?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to regulatory complexity. I just know that we need less of it.
I was just wondering how this compares to, for example, Indian native title situation in America. Are we and elsewhere around the world? Are we sort of behind the 8 ball, or further along the track comparably? So
Canada's often spoken about as the real leader in this area, and that's because in certain provinces in Canada, the government has put in place really enabling policy to ensure that First Nations people in Canada are able to take the lead. Price adders, so that, if the electricity is generated on First Nations land, there is a slight increase, preferential procurement, preferential contracts, things like that. Canada's a real leader in this area, yeah, and we're totally behind the 8 ball for that. Still, it's a positive picture, I would say. Well, that's the end of my presentation, but please, any more questions? And if there's any questions, I'm aware that I've walked around a lot and online there might not be.
Oh, look, this is just a technical point about common law, and you're going back to Queen Elizabeth I. Because it's related to the Crown, if Australia became a republic, would it be easier to get rid of common law?
Look, I think no. I think so. When we talk about the Crown in Australia, we're talking about the governments in essence, I think. And it would depend. I mean, if we became a republic, it would depend what model. But I think those rules are pretty well baked in. Yeah, I would say. Yeah. Any other questions? Any questions online? Thanks. You've asked lots of good questions.
Yeah, actually.
Okay, Liz. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, just it's really good to see the regular money come in for Indigenous communities and so on. But I mean, I was just sort of curious, are there links to link that for training in renewable energy and for, I guess it's not a position to ask how that money's being used, but I'm just wondering, is there a move to develop Indigenous people's skills to run these facilities themselves and these business themselves.
Oh,
Is
look,
that part of it? Or-
Absolutely is, and apologies if I didn't make that clear. Yeah, so groups, when they're negotiating these agreements, will prioritise what they want out of it.
Okay.
And so in, say, for mining agreements, some groups would say, okay, look, we need a lot more, employment for our young people, apprenticeships, employment pathways. Other groups say, we don't want to work in your mine, we just want the money. For renewable energy projects, yes, that is the case. The employment patterns differ from mining, but if that is what the group would like to prioritise, then that is absolutely something that they can negotiate in the agreement. Yeah, it's a great question. Rebecca?
Ask, for traditional owner groups without native title, are they still able to sit at the table, or what are the barriers for them to sit at the table?
So, yeah, it's a great question. And it goes back to what Nick was talking about with Gunai Kurnai, sea rights, they don't have any. And also, so groups like Ngari Ngari in New South Wales also didn't have any native title rights. It was called freeholded early, which means dispossessed early. I think, again, it goes back to a strong group with strong organisation, that there are ways and means of being very canny and negotiating handbacks of land, buybacks of land, also creating a narrative that you need to be at the table. Yeah.
Sometimes my experience is some groups do use other laws, particularly cultural heritage laws, to try to leverage what would otherwise normally be a native title outcome, i.e. compensation, and that's become pretty prevalent for projects on freehold land.
Okay. Any questions online, Lockie?
No.
Okay. I excluded them a bit. Anyway, thanks so much for coming, everybody. Thank you.
I'd like to quickly also thank you, Lily, for coming in today. I mean, I certainly took a lot away from that. I imagine everyone else did too. That was a great presentation. And just as a note, this recording will be available on a Uni of Melbourne's YouTube channel in the near future if you want to look back at any of that. And we hope to see you all at some of the MCF events throughout the year. Thank you very much for coming.